So it is a pleasure to be here. I'm Dr. Jim Saeed, and by way of license and practice, I'm a naturopath and a chiropractor. And so we've been doing general and family practice for the last 45 years. It was hard to believe. And it's been a delight serving the patient population that I've been able to work with. I've been blessed by awesome patients. And we see everything from birth to death and common cold to cancer. So it's a very broad scope practice. And I tell my patients, they keep me in school, which is true. So to be a physician is to be a teacher first, and every physician's a medical missionary. And so I get the opportunity to witness to my patients, which I love. So I'd like to open up the floor to questions of any kind for yourselves, your family, your friends. And I've lectured to not fewer, but many more. And this is fine, a wonderful start, because you don't know who I am or what we've done. And that's fine. So any questions, you're most welcome to ask. And I'll repeat the question for the purpose of the recording and do my best to answer. And I like to answer in a way that really teaches you what's going on. So it's more than just do this for that. So I open the floor. Yes. So the question is, he's a friend with sciatic pain who just takes medication. Is there anything else he can do? So I do a lot of work in the world of functional neurology and functional orthopedics also. And we see a lot of sciatic cases. Now, sciatic pain is just pain down the back of the leg or the front of the leg or the side of the leg, depending on where the nerve distribution is distorted from the low back, typically, or the sacrum and tailbone. So most people have lumbosacral disc issues or swelling issues or inflammation on the nerve root. And the nerve roots from the low back innervate the hips, the thighs, the calves, the feet, the toes. And depending on where the pain goes, lets us know where in the low back the pattern is beginning. The higher up in the low back, the higher up in the lower extremity. The lower in the low back, the lower in the lower extremity. Sacrum down to the toes, L2, 3, L1, higher up in the hip and thigh. So where the pain is tells me a lot about where the problem is in the low back. Now, several reasons behind sciatic pain, ranging from the worst, which is a completely sequestered disc or blown disc that's completely removed from the disc material and is just pushing against the nerve root itself, to just what's called a pulsion or a swelling of the disc region pushing in toward the spinal cord. Sometimes you can get what's called a stenosis or a long-term swelling that becomes fibrotic. Now you have this chronic swelling around the nerve roots or around the cord itself. Now at that level in the low back, the spinal cord comes to its end around L2. From then on, it's called the cauda equina, which means the horse's tail. Because when you dissect it, it looks like a horse's tail, if you will, of nerves from the lumbosacral plexus down to the lower extremities. So nerves exit the spinal canal on either side through what are called the intervertebral foramen, or the holes between the vertebrae. That's all it means in Latin. And so if there's pulsion or swelling pushing against those, you can also generate sciatic pain. So the first thing we do is help get the inflammation down. So I take people off pro-inflammatory foods to start. Take out all the pro-inflammatory triggers. The worst of the worst is sugar, refined carbs, anything ending in ose, sucrose, galactose, maltose, dextrose. I tell my patients it ends in comatose. So easy to remember. So all the refined carbs, honey, there's high fructose corn syrup, cane sweeteners, sucanat, etc. And all the artificial sweeteners also, and artificial colors and dyes, artificial preservatives, These are all pro-inflammatory. We also test patients with foods for pro-inflammation. I find classic eggs and dairy, commonly reactive. Gluten, commonly reactive. Soy, commonly reactive. These are not uncommon. So we help people determine what the foods are that are pro-inflammatory and get them off of those. Then what we do is we look at why is the pain the way it is. Now, I've worked with patients up to the point of a fully sequestered fracture of the disc itself, okay, a true herniated disc. Although I had one patient with a true herniated disc that herniated so far down the sacrum, or the lumbar spine, along the cord, that they couldn't operate. And we got him out of pain. He's pain-free now. But he did what I asked him to do, which was awesome. So one thing we do is put people in what's called a 90-90 position. Now 90-90 is they're flat on their back, their hips are up and their knees are straight out like that. So the hips are 90 degrees, the knees are 90 degrees, they're on their back, they've got something under their calves supporting them, like a box or an ottoman or several pillows, depending on where they are, or a chair, and they lay like that for 45 minutes. Now, they put a hot water bottle under the tailbone, and you fill it about 1/3 to 1/4 full. It's still slushy. Just get a hot water bottle, fill it with hot water, 1/3 to 1/4 full, and you lay on it under the tailbone. Not the low back, but the sacrum, the tailbone. And when you lay on the tailbone like that, the snout of the hot water bottle is past the coccyx, past the tailbone, and you're laying on the body of the hot water bottle. And you're up in a 90-90 position, flat on your back, on the floor or a bed or on a sofa or whatever, but something that's flat, ideally. Floor works best, or a carpet. And your feet are up on an ottoman or a chair, or boxes or pillows. And you're that way for 45 minutes at a time. What that does is puts the body in a position called flexion distraction. So when you're up like that and you've got a hot water bottle under the tailbone, it's slightly lifting the tailbone forward into flexion. It's called flexion distraction. So it distracts the low back or lets it separate at the disc level. And slowly, slowly it reduces the stress on the disc and reduces the swelling on the disc at the same time. And then hot of the hot water bottle helps to relax the musculature around the lumbosacral junction. So those are great helps. 90-90 position, 45 minutes, flexion distraction, get the pro-inflammatory triggers out of the diet. Now, I'm very careful recommending chiropractic, because some chiropractors do what's called a lumbar roll, which should never be taught, in my opinion. I realize there's no such thing as a humble opinion, so I won't state it that way, but in my opinion, it's overdone when it shouldn't be used. So some doctors will actually create a worse situation by putting force into a disc that's already ready to herniate, or is already herniated, and they think it's just a rotation of the vertebra. There's ways of adjusting it very gently, and chiropractors learn those approaches if they're open to that. And then the flexion distraction, and then massage work to relax the musculature and depress or take out the compressive stresses on the low back. So it's all from compression of the low back. So all that's designed to distract and open and reduce the compressive forces on the low back. So if your friend does it that way, it'll help immensely, classically. Okay. Now, the pain is obviously not so bad that they've gone to see a neurosurgeon or orthopedic surgeon saying, let's get the disc out of there. So it's likely going to respond to very conservative measures like what I'm suggesting. Good. And if they have questions, they're welcome to call the office. I'll give you the office number, okay, it's from anywhere in the world, 541-773-8111. We've had that for 45 years. Okay, it's a known entity in Southern Oregon. It's 541-773-8111. I work remotely. Obviously, I'm out here and I have patients all over. But on something like this, I can walk them through it or do a virtual call and walk them through it. I've done a lot of orthopedic testing and neurologic testing with someone else there doing the work for me, if we have to do it that way, or refer them to someone that does that work. So those are options, but sciatic pain is not fun. I've had it in my experience. It's very painful. It's distracting from life. So I wish this person well to do what needs to be done and get through this one quickly. Good. Not at all. Okay, so there's, someone suffering of uterine prolapse. Usually it's uterine or bladder prolapse, which means the ligaments that support those structures start to become lax, and the organ begins to drop with gravity over time. So it depends on the extent of the prolapse and how old the person is and what status they're in. If it's someone who's quite obese, that's a different story. If it's someone who's more toned, that's helpful. One thing I suggest is Kegel exercises to strengthen the pelvic musculature. They're called Kegel exercises, K-A-G-E-L, Kegel exercises. Now, Kegel exercises are known by women to tonify the pelvic sling of muscles. The pelvic sling is what holds up the organs in the deep pelvis. Okay? It's a group of muscles that act like a sling under the pelvis to support that musculature. And there's also ligaments that hold those structures into the pelvic brim. So, simplest case is Kegel exercises, which is basically tightening the buttocks, tightening the muscles of the pelvis, lifting just by tightening and then relaxing, tightening and relaxing. Many people do that just by urination. They're urinating, they stop, start, stop, start, stop, start. Okay? Or you can lay on your back, feet flat on the floor, knees are bent. And you just lift the pelvis, tighten the buttocks, and come back down. Lift the pelvis, tighten the buttocks, come back down. Do 100 of those a day. I'm serious. I mean, yeah, it's 10 at a time, that's fine. So that's an important start. There's manipulation that we do that not many docs learn how to do. It's one reason Rhonda and I are creating a school in Idaho to start training doctors to do this kind of work, and to also train medical missionaries to do this kind of work. Okay. So there's manipulation that can be done to move the structures upward. It's done very gently, but it can be done, and it's teachable. Worst case requires suspensory ligament surgery. So a surgeon goes in and literally ties the structures up to the pelvic brim so they can't drop. And I've seen the whole range of that. I've seen people respond to conservative approaches. I've seen them not, and then have to do more surgical suspension support. So it depends on the person and their willingness to do what has to be done. If weight is an issue, the weight has to come down. For many women, it's not a weight issue, it's just a ligamentous laxity issue. Then we do nutrition to support ligamentous structure, especially minerals. Minerals are essential, especially magnesium and calcium and zinc and boron, things that support collagen structures that include bone. So the nutrition we use, for example, for osteoporosis, we use for that kind of thing also to support the ligamentous structure, the collagen structure that supports that. So the minerals I just mentioned are important. So there's process to be dealt with that way, but the process is one that needs to eventually support the whole musculature and ligamentous integrity of the pelvic region.
An elderly lady.
Okay, so an 84-year-old woman, she's thin and she's probably frail.
Yes.
So that's a different story. So she can at least do a good multimineral. I like a liquid multimineral for someone of that age. And there's different ones we suggest, but there's ways of going about that. The kind of magnesium she takes is important so it doesn't generate loose stool. So there's ways of managing that also with calcium and boron and zinc. There's other minerals we use, but those are the mainstay of it. And then protein's important. To make sure she assimilates protein. At that age, the tendency is to lose the digestive capacity in the stomach and small intestine and pancreas to break down protein and assimilate protein. So they tend to become protein deficient, which is what osteoporosis is also. So we make sure that they're assimilating protein with digestive enzymes, especially necessary each meal. We use full spectrum, very strong digestive enzymes. We also use betaine HCl or betaine HCl to acidify the stomach, which is necessary to happen to make sure protein gets assimilated, digested and assimilated. So those are part of the picture also. I do a lot of lab work. I do an immense amount of lab evaluation. And lab data shows us what's going on in this body that you can't see, but you can determine from what's circulating and what you're excreting. There's many ways of getting data. And so when we have that kind of data, it's clear as to what to actually do to support her physiologically. But minerals are important. She can still exercise with Kegel exercises. It's not going to be exhausting for her. So that's a start. Yeah. But that's an extenuating issue of someone that in that age group and more frail. So there's more to be dealt with than just Kegel exercises. Okay. Protein assimilation is really important for her. So she's got to be able to lay protein down to make the collagen to strengthen the ligaments and the muscle, etc. So 57 years old, overweight as a woman. You're not morbidly obese, but you're overweight.
I recall saying I was overweight.
Well, you mentioned abdominal fat. Yeah. So you're holding abdominal adipose, and you're experiencing GERD or reflux disorder, and you're bloated. You feel yuck. I would imagine energy's low often through the day. Sometimes it's hard to sleep, to get asleep or stay asleep. Sometimes bowel function can get interrupted. Constipation, loose stool, diarrhea, gas, bloating, all those are not uncommon, any combination of that. This is a common issue. You start out the question about hormones. About at 57 years old, what can you anticipate? So may I address these one at a time?
Sure.
Thank you. So as I said, this is terribly common. Not just not uncommon, it's terribly common. So where I start is I do 3 kinds of tests. I test blood for chemistries, I test blood for food antigens, and I test saliva for the steroid hormones from the adrenals. Okay? The ovaries are not the issue at this point, but the adrenals are. Now the adrenal glands, I'm going to do this stepwise with you. The adrenal glands produce cortisol and estrogen and progesterone and testosterone and aldosterone. Okay, these are adrenal steroid hormones. And they control metabolism of fat, of protein, of glucose, and of salt. So they determine the water consumption, the water utilization in the body. They determine brain function in terms of how you get cortisol to break down protein, to convert to glucose to feed the brain. And they determine also fat and protein metabolism. They're huge in terms of their function. They're called the stress glands of the body, and under stress, that's what we need to have managed. Now, by the time most people get to 57, the adrenals are pretty tired. So they can't do their job efficiently. So after menopause in women and andropause in men, which is male menopause, when the woman stops producing estrogen and progesterone through the ovaries, and men stop producing testosterone through the testes, the adrenals have to make up the difference. If the adrenals are fatigued, they can't do that very effectively. Then you start getting more and more fatigued. And you start seeing the estrogen progesterone deficiency conditions in women and testosterone deficiency conditions in men. So adrenal support is typically really important. So we see what that looks like through testing through saliva. I like using saliva because you can get the free fraction of the hormone as the cell is receiving it throughout the day without having to do blood draws. So I have my patients do 4 saliva collections in a day from morning till night, before each meal and bedtime, to get that rhythm reading. And then we know what to do to support that. That's one. Secondly, digestion of protein, like I was mentioning in this previous case. Around menopause, andropause, we stop digesting protein efficiently. We can't get the stomach acid enough, or what are called the chief cells in the stomach, to generate hydrochloric acid to break down protein. Then we start getting GERD. But it also is from gas that happens below the lower esophageal sphincter, between the stomach and esophagus. So as gas forms beneath that in excess, it starts pushing up on that sphincter. The sphincter then opens and allows chyme material or acid secretions in the stomach to pass upward into the esophagus, and you start getting that burning in the throat and heartburn. So it's actually not enough hydrochloric acid to break down proteins so they don't produce gas by fermentation, and to get other enzymes to break down starches so they don't ferment and stay in the stomach and produce more gas or in the small intestines. So digestive enzymes and hydrochloric acid are really important to support that process. That's 2. Third issue has to do with food. I respect food as an addiction or as a constant way of thinking about what's next in life. Common issue. So we measure the actual antibodies against about 200 different foods. And I use one lab in the country in Seattle that's very good, and one of the least expensive, as it turns out, but it's very good and accurate to get good repeatable data. And we find the foods that are reactive in the body, but it's a quantitative test. So I can tell how reactive each food is. In a case like yours, I would automatically run that test. And with that information, we can see what the diet needs to look like and not look like. Then it becomes your conscious choice to eat those foods or not eat those foods. Because if you do, you know what's going to happen. You're going to spike the antibodies. You're going to trigger the reaction across the blood-brain barrier, by the way. The brain's going to inflame and swell. You get less alert, more groggy, more foggy-headed. Not uncommon. More sleepy after you eat. Not uncommon. And you get more bloated, more discomfort, and more GERD. So as you start reducing those foods, now fortunately the stomach or the small intestine or GI tract is very forgiving. Every 3 days you have a new stomach and GI tract lining. Every 3 days. So the recovery time can be very quick. I see this routinely. I check in with a patient a week, 2 weeks later, and already they're feeling significantly better when they've shifted things, taking pro-inflammatory triggers out of the diet. And they don't want to go back. They get it. And then we start dealing with recipes, meal plans, etc. And that's where my wife is brilliant. My wife's a vegan chef. She trains chefs to become vegan chefs. And she does dietary consultation with my patients often. And then we also do retreats at the ranch where she does all the food direction and teaches patients how to do that work. And for good reason. Where do you learn that stuff? Yeah, and the learning curve can be several months. I tell most of my patients 3 to 6 months, but if they come to the retreats, it's weeks, because Rhonda's teaching people how to do that. But there's a learning curve to it. So as the diet starts to shift away from pro-inflammatory triggers, the stomach starts to settle down. The inflammation starts to reduce. The fat and the adipose levels start to come down. Now, there was an awesome study done at Stanford and Berkeley in the departments of chemistry, and I met the guy that did the research, and he showed how to reduce omental fat, belly fat. And there's 4 things in a meal to do that. Would you like to know what they are? Yeah. Good. I appreciate it.
We all do.
So what happens is, first and foremost, fruits and vegetables is the first group. Now, fruits are best done at the beginning of a meal. Don't put fruits at the end of the meal. Why? Because the sugars in fruits will ferment if they stay in the stomach too long. So you want them to get through the stomach quickly, like with leafy greens, like in salads or fruit smoothies, for example, or green smoothies. Now, if you put it at the end of the meal, like most people do with dessert, you have this sugar staying in the stomach too long and fermenting, turn into gas and alcohol. So you get bloated and drunk on your dessert. And then you create more gas pushing up on that lower esophageal sphincter, so you get more and more heartburn. So that's the first thing. Fruits at the beginning of the meal. Okay? Sometimes people are reactive to fruits like kiwi or pineapple or mango or bananas. I've seen all kinds of things show up. But we test those things. But we take fruits that you can tolerate, and typically many, but at the beginning of the meal. The second group is proteins. In the plant-based world, and I emphasize plant-based because I see many patients reactive to animal-based proteins. So I emphasize more plant-based proteins. That's going to be beans, leafy greens, and cruciferous vegetables. Now, some people don't tolerate beans well at all. The beans that I find least tolerated that we test for are soybeans, black beans, pinto beans, and navy beans. Those 4. So if you can, those are the most common. Now, some people tolerate them no problem at all. Others, those and others they don't tolerate because of what are called lectins. So when you make beans, cook them in an Instant Pot or a pressure cooker. Ideally sprout them or soak them for overnight at least.
If you don't sprout them, cook them twice.
There you go. If you don't sprout them, cook them twice. You want your beans soft, and as my wife teaches, never add salt until the beans are finished. Otherwise they don't get salt. They don't get soft. So you want your beans soft. Then you season them any way you like. Leafy greens, lots of ways to manage that. And the key with greens is chew your greens. You don't want to just juice them and gulp them. You want to chew them. The reason is greens have nitric oxide support that requires chewing to mix up the nitrates in the greens with, get this, with bacteria in the crypts of your tongue to convert them to nitric oxide in the stomach, as long as it's acid enough. That supports cardiovascular integrity. Okay, So chew your greens. And then cruciferous vegetables, best steamed. Cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, etc. Those are best steamed. The next group are starches, which is grains and roots and tubers and winter squashes. Okay? Now, grains generally are well tolerated, except gluten grains. I find classically gluten is poorly tolerated because it starts to break down the tight junctions in the gut cells, creating a leaky gut. I know there's a lot of information, but I'm giving you the overview. And then we fill a lot of details in when I get data. But the other grains like quinoa, amaranth, teff, taro, tapioca, etc., those do fine, ordinarily. And then the last group is going to be your fats. Now, fats are going to be nuts, seeds, nut butters, seed butters, avocados, and oils, and olives. Now, your manufactured seed oils like canola, for example, is horrible.
Yeah, we gave up those a long time ago.
Perfect, perfect.
Try to just stay with
Yeah.
a good grade olive oil.
That works just fine. Now, the amount becomes an issue. Usually a tablespoon of fats at a meal is enough for most people. And if the cholesterol levels are elevated, especially LDL cholesterol, then we reduce the fats and oils because you can't transport them efficiently without creating hardening of the arteries. That's a whole other issue. But from a dietary perspective, those four groups is what they found in their research at Stanford and Berkeley that reduces omental fat. From those four groups, just an equal balance from those four groups. So there's ways of managing the diet, ways of managing the hormones, ways of managing lifestyle in general to strengthen what's going on in your body. The last piece is exercise, okay, as you're able. And simple things, cardio and lightweight training. That's what I recommend. Most people do fine, maximum 20 minutes a day. One day they're walking 20 minutes, the other day they're doing lightweight training, 10 minutes, whatever. And I instruct my patients how to do that. But those are the things that help immensely. Now that was a long response, I realize. But you're describing something that has many facets to it. So those are the ways we deal with all of that. But once we have specific data that's unique to your body, then the details make themselves very clear. But you can start by just shifting the diet the way we've described. That's a start.
Do you feel that a vegan diet is more beneficial health-wise?
Ordinarily, yes. If you were diabetic, I'd say absolutely yes. If there's heart disease, I say no question. If there was cancer, no question. Now, may I make one response to the 10-year cancer recovery? Yeah, congratulations, first of all. That's awesome. And there are what are called cancer stem cells. Have you heard of those? Okay. So cancer stem cells tend to be what are called senescent cells. That is, they don't die. They don't go through normal cell death or cell apoptosis, they call it. And we want them to die. So there's certain nutrients that help them die. Things as simple as milk thistle or N-acetylcysteine, as an example. So there are things that I instruct my patients to use to see what they do tolerate, to support the process of destroying cancer stem cells. That's why many patients with cancer often have a recurrence because those cancer stem cells never were destroyed. So there's ways of managing that aspect also, which is really important. But a lifestyle diet is critical in managing the things you're describing.
What about a way that, so I feel like some of my problem sometimes with the food is it's not so much that I'm hungry, but I don't get that satiety trigger.
Right.
I feel like. What can you do to kind of help the body reach that and kind of change some of
Right.
those?
I appreciate the question. So satiety is a big deal. First of all, start with water. Just fill the belly up with water. And as my wife says, add lemon to it, especially in the morning. So drink water in the morning with lemon juice, just fresh squeezed lemon into it. And say a half hour before a meal, drink another glass of water. Hour after meal, another glass of water.
An hour after.
That's ideal. Half hour before, hour after, but not with the meal. Yeah, not with the meal. And so that process will help with the satiety problem. just developing a habit that way with water. And if you exercise, you find that the appetite begins to regulate more effectively also. And we're designed to eat 3 meals a day. So the other key to that is not snacking. You want to wait a good 4 hours to 5 hours between meals so the stomach and small intestines can fully empty. Because if you snack, you don't finish the digestive sequence of the previous meal. Now you end up with undigested proteins, which become foreign proteins to the body tags. Those are the things we measure in blood work. Those are the foods you don't tolerate. And they can become problems with creating autoimmunity further on down the line. So I'm sure you've heard of that concept. Fortunately, it's become well known now. So not snacking, getting water, getting exercise, eating the kinds of foods we're talking about will go a long way in improving what you're dealing with. And if you want details beyond that, I'm happy to work with, if you want, to work with a doctor that understands that, however that works best for you. But those are the areas of consideration.
You're not in this area, right?
Well, I have a virtual practice
Okay.
where I have patients now all over the world on a regular basis. So as long as we have access to a computer and internet and a phone, I have a practice. Yeah. So that's how I've been doing my life the last many years, actually. Even when I had a practice where I'd physically see patients, we still saw patients all over the country or the world by phone.
You go to
Good question. So the question is that with osteoporosis, you heard it's a silent disease. So it's going on and you find out about it after the fact when it's too late. Not uncommon. So osteoporosis is a demineralization of bone. Now people think often of bone as minerals, but bone is principally protein. So the minerals are anchored to the protein of the bone, to the collagen. So protein assimilation is critical. And as I mentioned in 2 cases already, in older women especially postmenopausal women, they tend not to digest protein efficiently. So that's when you use hydrochloric acid digestive enzymes to ensure proteins are taken in. I also make sure women get enough protein in the meal. I like them to get 15 to 18 grams of protein per meal, plant-based proteins. Just straightforward to do. So that's essential. To remineralize bone requires reproteinizing bone. And then we provide minerals as well. You don't want to overdo calcium because that can cause atherosclerotic issues or tissue hardening. So provide nutrients satisfactory for the person's needs to remineralize bone. There's different ways of going about that, different formulas, depending on what we're dealing with. But calcium, boron, magnesium, those are the primary constituents involved. But then the other key is exercise. We learned about this from the early astronauts. When they were up in space, they came back very demineralized, osteoporotic, because there was no gravity and they weren't exercising. So they began to exercise routinely in space to accommodate that issue. Now here we have gravity, but we don't exercise commonly, so we demineralize bone. So bone is a living tissue. It's always growing, fortunately. Not getting longer, but it's growing in terms of redoing bone structure. Gets reabsorbed and remade, reabsorbed and remade. Osteoclastic and osteoblastic activity, it's called. So what happens then is stress the bone. That's called exercise. Now most women do walking, ballet, things are lower extremities, but rarely strengthen the upper body. Okay? Guys strengthen the upper body, but rarely strengthen the lower body, unless they're doing squats and things like that. So walking and light weight training does well. That's why I like 2 sets of 20 reps for women, working out the entire body each week, upper extremities, trunk, lower extremities, with weight training, and then cardio. I like, ideally, cardio that's conditioning over time of aerobic and anaerobic. It's called peak 8 or high intensity interval training. So you do a 2-minute warm up, then you walk fast for 30 seconds, then you walk a little slower for 1.5 minutes, and you do that 8 times. And then a 2-minute cool down, that's 20 minutes. I have my patients do that 3 days a week. And the other 3 days, light weight training. 10, 12 minutes, doesn't take long. Working out a third of the body 3 days a week, so the whole body gets worked out every week. So stress in the bone is essential with walking, cardio, and light weight training. Now by light weights, I don't mean feathers. I mean whatever weight you can comfortably manage, 2 sets of 20. And the stronger you get, the more weight you can lift. Okay? And there's lots of places online to find out how to lift different weight. patterns for the different muscle groups. But I provide my patients with lists of what to wear, what to lift, and what to work out when. But weight training is critical. So for example, I have my patients do biceps, triceps, and shoulders one day. The next day, chest, lats, and back. The next day, the buttocks, thighs, and legs. And each day, abs. So they're working out the whole body in a full week. And then go out and do cardio, PK exercising every other day. I tell my patients, nature takes one day off a week to rest, Sabbath, Friday night to Saturday night. And that's in nature, we know that. So give the body a rest on Sabbath, work out Sunday through Friday. And patients do that and do very well. So I've seen many women especially, and some men, recover from osteoporosis, reverse that bone density depletion by doing just these kinds of things. It's a good question, and it's a big issue. Good, not at all. Any other questions?
Like I say, do you ever
Yes.
work with children that kind of had traumatic beginnings? We have 2 little boys that we both adopted when they were 2 and a half. They're now 10 and 14.
Wow.
But they were, the 14-year-old physically abused and neglected. The 10-year-old severely neglected. When they placed him with us at 2 and a half, he only weighed 19 pounds.
Oh,
So we have a lot of issues sometimes where it seems like their whole fight or flight is
Right.
always set off. So getting them to settle down and relax enough to go to sleep. The 14-year-old sneaks food. He sneaks, stuff. But the first time in my whole life, I have a locked cabinet because if
Right.
it's not guarded, he will get up in the middle of the night and eat a pack of Oreo cookies or
Right.
drink a 2-liter, soda.
wow. Okay, so you're describing something that's large. And I'm sorry to hear it for their sakes and for yours. So first question, were there any fetal alcohol issues or fetal drug issues?
Could you tell us a
Okay.
question for that?
Now the question, thank you. So there's 2 boys that you've adopted. Early on, they're now 10 and 14. And they had early childhood significant trauma. It's playing itself out in behavior patterns now. Fight or flight, binge eating, secret eating currently. And I'm sure there's a lot of behavioral issues that go along with all of that.
Not too bad. I mean, they've come through that pretty well.
Good.
There's sometimes some regulation control about how dramatically the 14-year-old is going to react to something.
Right.
But he's still pretty well able to be kind of pushed back and say, tell me what's happening.
Okay.
Talk me through why we're here.
Good.
With it.
That's fantastic. So you're saying the 14-year-old especially can discuss his issues with you
Yeah,
and respond accordingly. That's fantastic. So, several things. When there's fetal alcohol and fetal drug issues, that's a problem. And the fight or flight problem is classic. So what happens is this. Excuse me. Where do I start? So I'll tell you where I typically start. Sometimes I feel like a pediatrician. I work with a lot of kids over the years. And one thing I do a lot of work is cranial work. So there's ways of working with the cranium and the facial structures to manipulate the bones back to a normal rhythm. Many people are stuck in a status of extension, which is I call it a startle reflex, and there's no rest. So they're stuck in a mode of not knowing what to do and having this pent-up energy with no place to take it. There's no rest, ever. So we work with them to discharge the shock in the cranium and the nervous system and bring the cranium and nervous system back into a state of rest, which it can't get into on its own. And when that happens, then they can begin to rest, all right? That's a big issue. The other thing is we take out the foods that are triggers to inflammation, to the brain. Sugar.
Seems to be a universal problem in my household at this point.
I'm noticing there's a pattern here. So sugars, sodas, coffee, chocolate, tobacco, cigarettes, black tea, all the stimulants, okay? Those are crucial to let go of. Also, red meats can be overstimulating, by the way, for young ones. So I'm very careful with that. Then we look at the diet. We look at what other foods can be stimulating and overdriving of inflammation. So we take those out of the system. I work with lots of kids that way, even 2-year-olds, that get it because they start feeling better. They go, Mom, I don't want to eat that. I don't feel good when I eat that. And they know it. I'm amazed. I see this routinely. So 10 and 14, they'll understand. And I talk with the kids who I work with very directly. They're the patient. And they get that they are important, and I'm working with them. It's really cool. I mean, I love working with kids like that. So we take all the things out, no artificial colors or flavors at all. When artificial color is taken, it's known now in research. I just read this recently, and the guy that did the research I know personally. He's one of the foremost immunologists in the world, Dr. Vojdani, down in LA. And he actually developed the lab approaches to determine this information. And he proved that food dyes will coat proteins in the diet, and they prevent the enzymes from breaking the proteins apart at those sites. So now you end up with undigested proteins that the body attacks as foreign proteins that look like our proteins in our body, many of them looking like what's in the nervous system, like the cerebellum or Purkinje cells or structures in the brain. So the brain starts to swell from autoimmune reactivities. It's a serious issue. Oh, I see it in Hashimoto's disease, for example, in the thyroid gland, or in type 1 diabetes in the pancreas. All right, these are autoimmune conditions affecting those particular organs, and they're damaging, turning them to scar tissue. So we take all those triggers out of the diet. That's really critical, okay? But I have a one-to-one chat with the child saying, here's what's going on, here's what your body's showing us. It's a very matter-of-fact discussion, and they get that. And so these are simple things to do. Now, hands-on work is obviously not virtual. That's hands-on. So you can find someone local that does that work. It's cranial work and maxillofacial work. Now, I like the osteopathic approach. Okay, I've studied many, many different systems, developed systems over the decades. I like the old osteopathic work, and I've developed it further. And that's something we want to teach in our ranch also, because it's becoming a lost art. I've sent people to osteopathic colleges where they teach that, and they still don't get it. It's very sad to see. So I want people to start learning that, and I've been asked to start teaching that on the West Coast in one of the chiropractic colleges. But I want to teach it at our ranch also to people that want to learn this work. But if you can find someone to start that work, it'd be awesome. They just have to be able to feel the dynamics, the dynamism of that rhythm, and be able to open up out of that extension startle pattern and get it back into extension flexion rhythm, primary respiratory rhythm. That's important. In my experience, that's important. But the dietary component is also extremely important. Now, dealing with the effect on the brain of drugs and alcohol from fetal trauma, and the trauma itself is dealing with brain chemistry. And we do a lot of work around brain chemistry. So, but those are more specifics that I need to know from the child to know how to best deal with that. There's 4 major schools of thought about how to manage that. And that's not the scope. But there's ways of dealing with that effectively to support the child in regenerating a lot of the brain chemistry that's been distorted from the trauma.
We're going to be here for a while.
Especially serotonin and dopamine and GABA. Those are the primary ones. And serotonin and dopamine especially. So there's ways of dealing with that. I work with kids around this a fair amount. When that's been depleted from early trauma. I work with a lot of adults that deal with that, with anxiety, depression, a whole host of issues that happen from there, OCD patterns, etc.
We're going to be here for a month.
As my wife's acknowledged, we'll be for another month, so if they have questions we can check things, but that's up to you. I wish I knew someone around here I could just refer to.
Yeah.
Say, go see them.
We did see, like, in the 14-year-old, we saw a lot of improvement in moving into this area. He became interested in wanting to play sports.
Sure.
And so during football season, that was the first year he played, we saw a decrease in the food seeking
Right.
and an increase in his desire to socialize and do things. I mean, he's not withdrawn or anything like that, but
Right.
we were in counseling before we moved out here with him, and the doctor just always, a new pill. You know, we're going to give him Restoril to make him sleep, and we're going to give him Wellbutrin because maybe he's depressed. And the child himself was like, I don't feel depressed. I don't
No.
want to hurt myself. I don't want to hurt others. And so he didn't want to take them. I felt uncomfortable giving him a whole lot of drugs. So
Yeah.
we did they had him on clonidine for a long time
Wow.
when he was 4 and 5 years old. And we just really worked to get away from that. He
Good.
will go to sleep now, but it's usually 1, 2 o'clock in the morning.
Okay.
And then about 3, I know that he will raid cabinets.
Right.
But
So,
he did
so
better. So I know that serotonin's got to be off because the exercise made a difference.
yes, and serotonin makes melatonin, which supports sleep. So, and exercise also supports that, as you acknowledged. The drugs that were being used were actually counterproductive to his brain recovery. It would not permit brain recovery. I see this all the time. People are taking multiple drugs to try to control emotion, appetite, OCD patterns, etc. And it's making the pattern progressively worse. Because these are what are called presynaptic neuron issues, not postsynaptic neuron issues. You know what that means?
Vaguely.
So the brain is a 2-neuron system, and they meet in what's called a synapse, or a junction between 2 neurons, 2 nerve cells. And in that synapse, you have neurotransmitters or brain hormones that trigger response and receptors to let the second neuron do what it's designed to do. Okay. Now, what doctors don't do is treat the presynaptic side by providing serotonin and dopamine support, or GABA support, but serotonin and dopamine create GABA. So they don't provide the raw materials that cross the blood-brain barrier to make the presynaptic neurotransmitters or hormones to drive the process the way it's done physiologically. Instead, they deal with the second side, the postsynaptic side, by using drugs that keep the hormone or the neurotransmitter in the synapse too long. So now you force the second neuron, the postsynaptic neuron, after the synapse, postsynaptic, to create more and more receptor sites to that neurotransmitter. So you create a worse problem. So now you become dependent upon the drug. So we help people come off of that stuff to be able to provide nutrients to create the presynaptic neurotransmitters properly to straighten out that picture and let it heal. So that's a big issue. That's a huge part of this kind of process with your son. And exercise is great for him. Team sports is fantastic. By the way, I call you guys angels. Every patient, every person, every parent that I see that takes care of kids like this, you're angels. But you can't say that, I realize. Angels cannot call yourself angels. But you're angels, and I thank you on their behalf. I really do.
I've also suffered with sciatic nerve.
Ah.
Similar to what was talked about earlier. Mine goes out, when I pick up something wrong, or
Okay.
Or sometimes I'll just bend over wrong.
Right.
And so then I'm down for a week with my back.
With sciatic pain?
And it usually travels down.
Right. How far down does it go?
Depends on the severity, but usually only just shallow. I have had to go all the way down to my heel. But,
Down to your heel? How about the big toe?
I can't.
Okay.
Although when it does go out, my feet will oftentimes get a little numb.
Okay. So that's typically L5 involved down to the heel. And the less pressure, so the question is, you also get sciatic pain down the back of the right thigh to the knee, sometimes even to the heel.
Either side. Sometimes it'll be one side, sometimes it'll be the other.
Okay. So it's not uncommon to get, it can be on either side. So it's not uncommon to get what's called a broad bulge on the disc that can affect both nerve roots. So again, the 90-90 position is important.
Okay.
Moist heat to the low back. Now, does it hurt when you arch your back backwards, like you're on the floor face down, and you try to arch upwards, lifting up your head and chest without using the arms?
I can't say for sure. I don't remember trying that.
Okay. So if that's the case, a lumbosacral facet is also involved. Then moist heat to the low back, 20 minutes every night.
Okay.
And then the 90-90 position 45 minutes every night. Now, if it's both sides, as I said, it's a broad bulge disc issue. And so it still responds to the same protocol.
Okay.
Developing core strength becomes important when it's not in pain. So that's crucial. So exercise for you is essential like the rest of your life.
Sure.
So core strength, abdominal strength, low back strength, and they're reciprocal. That's why core strength is so important to low back issues, because the abdominal musculature strengthens and supports the low back and vice versa. So core strength is crucial. And when you look at the abdominal musculature, I used to do a lot of dissection, taught gross anatomy, human dissection. The abdominal musculature is huge. We think of just a six-pack. It's far bigger, and it's 3 layers, and it goes around most of the body and covers an immense span of the whole abdomen region, the whole abdomen, and around toward the back. And it's the English flag, we call it. It's crisscross and straight up and down and across. So it's a large muscle group that requires stability. So you want a good set of abs and core strength to support you. And there's all kinds of exercise systems that do that, going from reasonable to crazy. But you can do whatever you're inclined to do, but strengthen that and maintain that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's important.
Yeah, I know when it does go out, it can be, it can be very painful. I feel like you gotta. I get up in the morning, I have to roll out of bed and work myself up.
I appreciate it. So it's extremely painful, but it happens. Getting out of bed's a chore.
Yeah, and I've also found I have to sleep on my side. I can't sleep on my back.
You found out what?
I found I have to sleep on my side. I can't
Okay.
sleep on my back.
Correct.
With like a pillow between my legs.
Yeah, so it's hard to sleep on your back. You have to sleep on your side, the pillow between your knees. Very common. So even the side you sleep on is important depending upon what the low back looks like that's affecting the disc. But the 90-90 will help, and strengthening the abs and the whole trunk will help immensely. But don't do that if you're in pain,
Sure.
other than the 90-90, obviously.
Right.
Good.
Okay. Thank you.
That's a start. Good. Any other questions or comments? Now I want to make one comment. There was a discussion about thyroid issues, and I've yet to see a group without thyroid issues. This is the first time. So I'm going to address it for the purpose of people watching this. So what I see commonly is hypothyroidism and what's called Hashimoto's disease. You may know people that have this as an issue, but it's an autoimmunity against the thyroid gland. And the triggers are gluten, eggs, dairy, soy, and sugar, especially gluten, eggs, and dairy. This is known research, published research, peer-reviewed research, showing that the body can't tolerate those foods. Those foods have molecules, protein structures that look just like the thyroid gland, or parts of the thyroid gland. So the immune system attacks those protein structures because they're not fully digested, especially in gluten. Gluten used to be 5% of wheat. Now it's 50% in wheat. So we don't have the enzyme capacity to break that down. So we end up with undigested gluten, or gliadins, called omega gliadins. And now the body attacks those as foreign proteins because they're undigested. So those undigested proteins are not amino acids. They're chains of them together. So the body sees that's a foreign protein, like a bug. Get rid of it. So it creates antibodies against it and said, I'm going to go look for that same protein structure to get rid of it out of my body. And it says, oh, there's one. Just happens to be your thyroid gland. So the body attacks the thyroid gland, converting it to scar tissue. It's an autoimmune condition. It's an immune system issue. Thyroid issues secondary. So many people brush to treat the thyroid gland, but never treat the autoimmune condition. We treat the autoimmune condition first. Certain nutrients to protect the thyroid gland, especially vitamin B10 called PABA, pyrimidine-benzoic acid. And then we use other nutrients to downregulate the attacking aspect of the immune system and upregulate the other part of the immune system that's been depressed because of that. Now the other thing we see is thyroid deficiencies. And we use thyroid support that's unique for each person. There's no one-size-fits-all ever. I see many patients over time improving thyroid function as the liver improves. Why? When the thyroid creates thyroxine, T4, which is a storage form of thyroid, it's not the active form, it's a latent form. It has to convert to T3, or liothyronine, which is the active form of thyroid. So the active form is what stimulates metabolic rate through every cell of your body. The T4 levels have to convert. 60% of that conversion happens in the liver, 20% in the gut. The other 20% converts to reverse T3 to balance T3. That's how the body manages not overdriving it. And so there's ways of managing that uniquely for each person. There is no one size fits all. There are now 7 major approaches to treating thyroid medication and managing that. And there's no one works for everybody. Oftentimes we have to do hybrid approaches to tailor it for each individual. So that's a big deal. We also treat Graves' disease, which is an autoimmunity against the thyroid causing hyperthyroidism. Sadly, what many doctors do is they whack out the thyroid, or they irradiate it, or they poison it to destroy the thyroid gland, which should never happen because we know how to treat it. There's one drug that we use to help bring it to bay called methimazole, and then we get them off of that onto Blue Flag and other kinds of nutrients that do the same thing a little more slowly, sometimes not so slowly. So we try to find our way to botanical support principally, take out the triggers, eggs, dairy, gluten, soy, sugar, get them out of the diet. Don't use them. You can't bring this under control if you're taking those foods that are triggering this reaction. Treat the autoimmunity, relax the thyroid functionality, and then bring it into functionality. Now, one last point. Most docs, MDs, and many naturopaths are taught a medical model. I want you to understand this. They're taught to look at labs, for example, as normals. You've heard that term normal? Right? What does normal mean to you?
Setting on your dryer.
Pardon?
A setting on your dryer.
Normal is a setting on your dryer? Statistically, normal has a very rigorous meaning. Normal is called a bell-shaped curve. So in statistics, many things follow the bell-shaped curve in nature and in manufacturing, etc. And we study statistics in engineering. That was my first profession at Stanford, is mechanical engineering and bioengineering. And so statistics is just part of our study. And you study the normal distribution. Well, when you go out 2 standard deviations from the mean, and the normal distribution encompasses 95% of the population, medicine adopted that and calls that normal. So if you're normal, you're as sick as 95% of the population. Now, when I look at labs, I tell my patients I'm going to look at this 2 ways. As your physician, MD will look at it, as I'm going to look at it. So I say, look, it's going to take me under a minute to look at it as an MD. So I look at the labs, and sure enough, everything's highlighted, normal and abnormal. If it's abnormal, it's highlighted in bold or red or whatever. You look for those, go, that's not bad enough, that's not bad enough. Oh, here's something. Here's the drug you're going to take. Here's what you're going to do. I'll see you in 6 weeks. They said, that's exactly what they told me. Every time, that's exactly what they told me. So you can get in and out in literally 3 minutes. 10 minutes is a long consultation. Okay? There's no discussion. You look at the information, you say, here's what's going on, here's the drug, take this drug, check in 6 weeks. And that's common practice. Here's the fallacy. Normal is not optimal. Normal is not what we're directed toward. We're not trying to be as healthy as 95% of this population. Lord help us. All right? The population is getting progressively sicker. So the lab values keep changing to reflect the sicker population, except in glucose, sugar, and cholesterol. The population is so sick now that they can't use normals any longer to determine health. They're so off the chart bad that they've had to downregulate the numbers to call them normal, and even that is not optimal. So we look at optimal values based on research for every single lab parameter that's done. That's a lot of study. So we study all that for all those values and look at the lab data that way. It takes now an hour, not 1 minute, to go over all that information and make sense of it and put together a protocol to begin to move the body toward optimized physiology. So until you can answer the question why, don't do anything. So you can look at the data and say, here's what's going on, here's why it's happening. Now you can begin to get a sense of what you do about it. But until you can answer the question why, don't start. It's too soon. So that's why we dig a lot to understand what's going on with my patients, to make sense out of why this is happening the way it is, to describe why a person is experiencing what they are. You reason from cause to effect. That's what that's called. So I just want you to understand that. There's a difference between normals and optimal values, and optimizing physiology and reasoning from cause to effect. When you do, now you start bringing about true healing. So then you're not looking for a drug to mitigate symptoms, you're looking for a protocol to manage healing. Recovery of systems, recovery of organs, recovery of the body, recovery of the mind, of the brain, of health overall. So it's vigorous. So we're at an optimal weight, optimal physiology, optimal strength, optimal thinking. Okay? This is critical. So I look at healing from that perspective. And that's what we're starting to teach now. I'll share one last story with you. My wife and I were invited to a conference years ago in San Diego. And it was an annex of one of the universities teaching naturopathic students. And they asked the old timers to come and lecture to these students. I was the oldest old timer, which was a sobering fact. And I knew much of the other people that came to lecture. So I had a preparation, a whole lecture prepared, and I was ready to do a 2-hour talk. And I talked to some of the students, actually many of the students, beforehand. And I was saddened by what I heard. They were no longer learning true naturopathic principles, healing principles. They were learning to become MDs, how to dispense drugs. So I threw out my notes. I literally tossed them. I said, and I prayed. I said, Lord, help me reach these people for truth. And I just opened both barrels. And they let me talk for a number of hours. Some of the other presenters gave me their time because they saw what was going on. I just totally opened up. I said, look, here's what it means to practice as a true naturopath. Here's what it means to affect healing. Here's what you think about. Here's what you consider. Here's what you study. Here's what you ask. Here's what you put together. These are the arenas that you're going to be dealing with each patient. And if you don't study these and know how to integrate them, you can't help the people the way you're wanting to help them. And I pray people would listen with that. But that's what we want to start training doctors to do. And we want to start training medical missionaries also to go in the field and help people in their homes, wherever they are on the planet, or their neighborhoods. We want to start training doctors to work with medical missionaries in the field so they've got backup of people that have licenses to diagnose and understand these things to help them put these together. So there's backup to that. This is important. So we're wanting to create a network of people to practice this way, to take this work to the world, to begin allowing people to really heal, to really recover. Now, one last point, if I may. I know I said that was the last point, but it's part of the last point. Here's what I see routinely in practice. As a person recovers, their brain starts to heal. Their brain starts to cleanse. They naturally start thinking about heaven, about spiritual things. They naturally are inclined in that direction. I've seen that open up consistently in practice. So I encourage that healing, that recovery, and that kind of discussion that happens about where is my life going? What does healing really encompass, even spiritually? So this is an important direction to consider, but it's what I see inevitably happen. So, not bad. Any last questions or comments before we finish? Good. All right, I'd like to thank you all very much. It's been a pleasure. And we look forward to following up further. So again, have a wonderful evening, and we'll look forward to more.